Humanity stopped asking permission on a quiet rotation cycle that the Galactic Council did not bother to officially record, because at that moment humans were still classified as a developing species with limited reach, limited influence, and a habit of speaking carefully when surrounded by older powers. And the story began years earlier when human envoys first walked into the council chamber orbiting the blue giant star Karshal, a place built to intimidate newcomers with vast distances, towering crystalline structures, and a seating arrangement that placed founding species high above the floor while newer members stood below, and the human delegation stood there calmly while delegates from the Virex Dominion whispered that humans were soft, while the Thal Union quietly logged every human word for later analysis. And while the Kree Collective openly questioned why a species that had only recently unified its home world had been allowed into interstellar space at all, and among the humans that day was Ambassador Daniel Harper, a man in his early 50s with a slow voice and a habit of listening longer than he spoke, and beside him stood Admiral Laura Bennett, present not as a threat, but as a symbol, a reminder that humanity did have a military, even if it was rarely mentioned. And when the council speaker announced that humanity's request for expanded trade lanes would be reviewed in several cycles, Harper nodded politely and thanked them for their time, even as Virex Noble laughed and said that humans should be grateful for what they already had, because lesser species often lost even that much, and humanity accepted the insult, because at that stage humanity was still asking, still negotiating, still hoping that reason and cooperation would secure a place among the stars. And back on Earth, news feeds framed the council session as a success simply because no sanctions were imposed. And analysts explained that patience was the price of survival in a crowded galaxy. But beneath that patience, something else was growing, something born from a long human history of being underestimated. And it was fed quietly by every delayed vote, every restricted corridor, every time a human ship was stopped and inspected while larger empires passed unchallenged. And this tension sharpened when a human research outpost on the edge of neutral space went dark without warning, a small station crewed by scientists and technicians studying stellar particle flows. And when the signal vanished, Earth Command sent inquiries through official channels, and the response from the Council was slow and vague, suggesting possible system failure or pirate activity, and recommending that humanity refrain from unilateral investigation until a joint committee could be formed, and Harper followed protocol, even as Admiral Bennett requested permission to dispatch a reconnaissance task group, and the answer came back as a polite denial, citing regional stability, concerns, and humanity waited, and in that waiting learned the cost of asking permission, because weeks later debris from the outpost was discovered by an independent trader, and the evidence showed weapon impacts consistent with Kree collective suppressor beams. And when this information reached the Council, the Kree delegate dismissed it as coincidence and accused humanity of spreading unverified claims. And the Council agreed to further study, and Earth's leaders sat in a quiet room watching. The feed as the decision was postponed yet again, and that was when President Alan Brooks, a former logistics officer turned civilian leader, leaned back and said that humanity had done everything right and achieved nothing, and Admiral Bennett said that the fleet had tracked Kree patrol movements near the outpost weeks before the attack. And Intelligence Director Samuel Ortiz added that intercepted Kree communications referred to a cleansing operation targeting unauthorized structures, and still the official response from the galaxy was silence. And in that silence, humanity began to change, not with a declaration or a speech, but with orders quietly signed and sent through secure channels, authorizing defensive readiness increases, accelerating shipyard schedules, and activating contingency doctrines that had been designed decades earlier and never used. Doctrines based on one simple assumption, that someday asking would no longer be enough. And while the Council debated language, human fleets repositioned under the guise of training exercises, and human engineers finalized systems that had been tested only in simulations, and human diplomats continued to smile and speak softly even as humanity prepared for a future where smiles would no longer matter. And the breaking point came when the Kree Collective formally announced an exclusion zone that overlapped several human trade routes, effectively cutting off colonies that depended on those lanes. And the Council endorsed it as a temporary security measure, advising humanity to reroute traffic and comply. And Harper requested an emergency session, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was a weight behind it that some delegates noticed too late, as he said that humanity could not accept the exclusion, that human lives depended on those routes, and that any interference would be considered hostile, and the chamber reacted with disbelief, with murmurs and sharp laughter, and the Virex delegate openly asked if humanity planned to fight the collective, and Harper replied that humanity planned to protect itself, and the council speaker reminded him that enforcement authority rested with recognized powers, not with developing species, and Harper nodded, thanked the council for clarification, and ended the transmission. And that moment, that quiet end to a diplomatic session, was the day humanity stopped asking permission, because within hours human convoys moved through the exclusion zone under escort, and when Kree patrol ships moved to intercept, they encountered human vessels that did not slow, did not deviate, and did not respond to demands to stand down. And when the first Kree suppressor beam fired, it struck a human escort frigate and failed to penetrate its layered defense field, a field tuned specifically to Kree weapon frequencies, and human response was immediate and precise, disabling the Kree ship with a focused kinetic strike that shattered its propulsion, without destroying the hull, and across the sector similar encounters unfolded, not as chaotic battles, but as controlled demonstrations, and reports flooded the council chamber as Kree commanders demanded explanations, and humans calmly transmitted footage showing that they had been fired upon first, and the galaxy began to realize that while it had been debating humanity's place, humanity had been preparing for the consequences of being denied one. And as Admiral Bennett watched the live, tactical feed from Earth Command, she said quietly that this was only the beginning, because humanity was no longer seeking approval, it was asserting presence, and the galaxy was about to learn what that truly meant. The galaxy reacted slowly at first, as it always did when assumptions were challenged, and while Council archives logged the convoy incidents as minor border disputes, those who paid attention noticed patterns that could not be dismissed. Because human ships were no longer avoiding contested regions and were no longer requesting escorts from recognized powers, and instead they moved with quiet confidence, their formations tight, their responses measured, and their communications brief. And within days, Kree collective commanders began filing reports that human defenses were adapting in real time, that weapon frequencies were being countered within seconds, and that human ships disengage at will, never pursuing, never posturing, simply continuing on their routes as if resistance were an inconvenience rather than a threat, and this unsettled the collective more than open aggression would have, because it suggested planning and restraint rather than desperation. And back in the council chamber, the speaker called for explanations, and the Kree delegate accused humanity of violating established security protocols. And when Daniel Harper appeared on the screen again, he looked the same as before, calm and composed, and he said that humanity had not violated any agreements, that human ships were traveling through open space to reach human colonies, and that any attacks against them would be answered proportionally. And the Virex delegate scoffed and asked if humanity now claimed enforcement authority. And Harper replied that humanity claimed responsibility for its own people, nothing more and nothing less. And while the council argued semantics, events accelerated beyond their control, because the Kree collective deployed a larger patrol group to make an example of the next convoy, and this time the human escort included ships that had never been publicly displayed, vessels with hull geometries that confused targeting sensors, and propulsion signatures that did not match any known drive profiles. And when Kree forces attempted a coordinated interdiction, human ships did not form defensive lines or retreat. They separated, moved to patrol formation, and disabled command ships with pinpoint strikes that left crews alive but helpless, and the encounter ended in minutes. And the surviving Kree vessels broadcast emergency signals that were intercepted across multiple sectors, and traders, mercenaries, and minor powers began to whisper that humans were no longer playing by the unspoken rules. And on Earth, President Brooks convened a secure council of military and civilian leaders, and Intelligence Director Ortiz laid out projections showing that the galaxy's power structure relied less on raw strength and more on reputation, on the belief that certain species enforced order, and that belief was now cracking. And Admiral Bennett explained that humanity had spent decades studying alien doctrines, learning not how to match them but how to exploit their assumptions. And she said that most galactic militaries expected fear, negotiation, or escalation, but were unprepared for controlled defiance backed by precise force. And Brooks asked how far this path would go, and Bennett answered they would go as far as needed to ensure that no one could isolate or threaten humanity again. And as if to confirm her words, news arrived that a human colony on the edge of Thal Union space had been approached by Thal security vessels demanding revised compliance terms, and the colony governor refused and requested guidance, and the response from Earth was immediate and simple, instructing the governor to maintain normal operations and advising Thal commanders that human internal affairs were not subject to external review. And when the Thal Union protested to the council, the chamber filled with overlapping voices, some calling for sanctions, others urging caution, because traders were already rerouting around Krei and Thal territories. Sensing instability, and smaller species began quietly opening channels to human representatives, asking what humanity wanted. And Harper answered each inquiry the same way, saying that humanity wanted equal passage, mutual respect, and non-interference, and that humanity would no longer wait for permission to exist safely. And this message spread faster than any fleet, because it resonated with species that had lived under the shadow of larger powers, and in private sessions. Council analysts warned that if unchecked, human behavior could inspire widespread defiance, and that the established order might fracture, and the speaker proposed a unified show of force to remind humanity of its place. And a coalition was discussed, but hesitation crept in, because no one wanted to be the first to test human capabilities after the Krei incidents. And while debates dragged on, humanity continued to act, not aggressively, but decisively, reinforcing colonies, establishing independent navigation beacons, and publishing clear transit doctrines that stated where human ships would travel and how they would respond to interference. And these doctrines were followed exactly, creating predictability that contrasted sharply with the Council's indecision, and slowly the narrative shifted, as observers began to say that humanity was not destabilizing the galaxy. It was exposing how fragile stability had always been. And when a senior Krei commander finally addressed the Council, his voice strained as he admitted that further enforcement actions would require full mobilization, and that even then success was uncertain and silence followed, because for the first time a recognized power was admitting doubt. And in that silence the reality settled that humanity was no longer a question to be debated. It was a factor to be accounted for, and the galaxy had reached a point where responding would mean either accepting a new equal or risking a conflict whose outcome was no longer assured. The first open attempt to force a resolution came not from the largest empires, but from a mid-tier coalition that feared being squeezed between old powers and a rising humanity. And this coalition announced joint exercises near Human Corridor, declaring them routine and harmless, yet positioning warships close enough that even civilian sensors could read their weapon states. And the message was clear without being spoken, and Earth Command understood immediately, and Admiral Bennett ordered a response that surprised even some human officers, because instead of matching force with force, humanity sent a diplomatic convoy escorted by lightly armed ships and packed with observers, journalists, and neutral representatives. And when the coalition protested, Harper responded publicly that transparency benefited everyone and that humanity welcomed scrutiny. And this move stripped the coalition of plausible deniability, because any aggressive act would be witnessed and recorded, and the exercises continued under an uncomfortable spotlight. And during one maneuver, a coalition destroyer suffered propulsion failure and drifted toward a human ship, and alarms flared across both fleets, and human crews reacted instantly, deploying tethers and stabilizers that prevented collision and damage, and they did so without powering weapons or issuing threats, and the rescue was broadcast live, showing human sailors working alongside alien crews in open space. And the effect was immediate and profound, because across the galaxy viewers saw not an aggressive upstart, but a species confident enough to help even those posturing against it. And analysts noted that this was not softness but control, the kind that came from knowing one could prevail if needed. And inside, the council chamber reaction split sharply, with some delegates arguing that humanity was manipulating perception, while others questioned why the established powers had allowed themselves to appear reckless. By comparison, and behind closed doors, a coalition quietly scaled back its exercises, citing safety concerns, and humanity continued on its path. And as weeks turned into months, incidents accumulated, each reinforcing the same lesson, that interference with human movement would be met with calm resistance, that escalation would be answered precisely, and that intimidation would fail outright. And the Krei collective, humiliated by repeated losses of authority, began internal debates about restoring dominance, and a hardline faction gained influence, arguing that only decisive action would reassert control, and against the advice of some strategists, the collective authorized Operation Iron Veil, a plan to seize a lightly defended human logistics hub near the frontier, calculating that a quick victory would shatter the myth of human superiority. And the operation began with a sudden strike that overwhelmed local defenses and forced evacuation of non-combatants. And when news reached Earth, there was no panic, no emergency broadcast. Only a brief statement confirming the attack and assuring the public that response protocols were active, and those protocols unfolded with precision that stunned observers, because within hours human fleets emerged from dispersed positions that intelligence analysts had believed to be routine patrols, converging on a contested system from vectors that suggested long-term planning. And these fleets did not rush blindly. They established layer control zones, cut off Kree reinforcements, and began isolating the Seas hub with surgical strikes against supply nodes. And throughout the operation, human commanders transmitted clear warnings offering safe withdrawal, warnings that were ignored by Kree hardliners who believed humanity was bluffing, and the engagement that followed was brief but decisive, with human ships demonstrating coordinated maneuvers that neutralized Kree numerical advantages, disabling rather than destroying most vessels, and capturing intact command ships whose data would later reveal the depth of Kree miscalculation. And when the hub was retaken, human forces immediately shifted to evacuation and medical assistance, treating Kree wounded alongside their own, and footage of this spread faster than any official statement. And the council was forced into an emergency session because the balance had clearly shifted. And this time when Harper spoke, he did not threaten or demand. He simply laid out a timeline of events, presented evidence of aggression, and stated that humanity would consider any further attacks as acts of war. And the chamber was silent, not because of fear alone, but because the narrative that humanity was reckless or destabilizing could no longer be sustained. And even some long-dominant species began to understand that the day humanity stopped asking permission was not the day it chose conquest, but the day it chose responsibility for its own fate. And that realization carried consequences that would soon reshape the entire galaxy. The aftermath of the logistics hub incident marked a turning point that could be felt even in systems far from human space, because for the first time a recognized galactic power had launched a deliberate operation against humanity and failed in full view of neutral observers. And the data recovered from captured Kree command ships revealed not only tactical plans, but internal communications that showed how deeply the collective had underestimated human response speed, coordination, and political resolve. And when excerpts of those communications were selectively released through neutral channels, the image of Kree invincibility fractured, and smaller states that had long complied out of fear began reevaluating old agreements. And within the council, the emergency session devolved into accusation and deflection, with a Kree delegate insisting that rogue commanders had acted without full authorization, a claim quietly contradicted by timestamps and authorization codes embedded in the recovered data. And Daniel Harper listened without interruption before responding that humanity did not care whether the attack had been ordered by a council, a collective, or a single admiral, because the result was the same. Human lives had been threatened, and humanity had acted to stop it. And he added that humanity would not pursue retribution beyond securing its borders and routes, but it would also not accept apologies that came without structural change. And this statement unsettled many delegates because it implied that symbolic gestures were no longer sufficient. And back on Earth, President Brooks approved a policy shift that had been debated for years but never enacted: the formal declaration of autonomous human security zones, clearly mapped and publicly announced. And these zones did not claim ownership of space beyond existing human settlements and trade lanes, but they asserted the right to enforce passage without external approval. And when this declaration was transmitted to the council, it was framed not as an expansion, but as a clarification. And Admiral Bennett explained in a parallel briefing that ambiguity had invited exploitation, and clarity would now prevent it. And reactions varied sharply, with some species protesting that this undermined collective authority, while others quietly updated their navigation charts and complied. And as expected, the Kree collective rejected the declaration outright, but their capacity to challenge it had been diminished, because internal divisions widened as civilian sectors questioned the cost of continued confrontation. and intelligence reports indicated that Kree fleets were being redeployed defensively rather than offensively, and in the Thal Union similar debates emerged, with economic factions warning that human corridors had become too important to disrupt. And amid this shifting landscape, humanity took another unexpected step, inviting neutral observers and even former adversaries to joint rescue and disaster response exercises, openly sharing non-lethal technologies and coordination protocols. And this move reframed human military capability as a stabilizing force rather than a threat, and analysts across the galaxy noted that humanity was shaping norms rather than breaking them, setting expectations through consistent action rather than decrees. And yet beneath this outward openness, Earth Command continued to refine deeper contingencies, because Admiral Bennett understood that acceptance born of convenience could fade quickly if fear returned, and she ordered war games that simulated worst-case coalitions, supply disruptions, and information warfare, ensuring that humanity would not be caught unprepared again. And one such simulation became reality sooner than expected, when an unidentified fleet began probing human sensor networks from beyond mapped space, using signature masking techniques unlike those of known powers. And this intrusion triggered a coordinated response that remained invisible to the public as human systems adapted and tracked the probes without escalation. And the data gathered suggested the presence of observers rather than attackers, possibly ancient powers that had remained hidden while younger empires contested the open galaxy. And when Harper briefed the Council on this development, he did so not ask permission but to inform, stating that humanity would investigate and respond as needed, and inviting others to share intelligence if they wished. And the contrast was striking, because where once humanity had stood beneath towering seats asking for access, it now spoke as an equal contributor to galactic security. And some delegates resented this shift, while others felt relief that someone was willing to act decisively without seeking dominance. And as weeks passed without further major incidents, a fragile calm settled, but it was a calm built on a new understanding that humanity would not be constrained by indecision or tradition when its survival was at stake, and that the galaxy's future would no longer be shaped solely by those who had arrived first, but by those willing to take responsibility when old systems failed. The quiet that followed did not mean peace. It meant recalculation. And throughout the galaxy, intelligence agencies, merchant guilds, and military planners began adjusting models that had stood unchanged for centuries, because humanity had demonstrated something far more dangerous than raw power. It had demonstrated adaptability combined with restraint. And this combination made prediction difficult, and difficulty bred anxiety, and that anxiety surfaced first in economic pressure rather than open conflict, as several trade blocs announced revised tariffs and inspection regimes that disproportionately affected human shipping, while remaining technically within Council guidelines. And the intent was clear to those watching, to slow humanity without provoking a response that could not be controlled. And on Earth these measures were analyzed carefully, not as isolated acts, but as a coordinated attempt to reassert leverage. And President Brooks asked whether this was the moment to push back directly. And Harper advised patience, saying that pressure revealed fear, and fear created openings, and instead of retaliation, humanity responded by accelerating internal logistics, expanding domestic production, and opening alternative routes through less developed regions, investing heavily in infrastructure that benefited local species, as well as human colonies. And this strategy paid off faster than expected, because worlds long neglected by major powers welcomed the investment. And soon human flag convoys were moving through regions that had never seen such traffic, creating new dependencies that shifted economic gravity. And when the blocs realized their tariffs were losing effectiveness, frustration grew, and within the Kree collective that frustration boiled over into a leadership crisis, as factions blamed each other for the loss of influence, and one group, desperate to restore credibility, leaked claims that humanity was secretly preparing for large-scale conquest, hoping to rally support through fear. And these claims spread rapidly until Earth Command made an unusual choice, declassifying portions of long-term defense planning documents and releasing them publicly, showing not invasion timetables, but layered contingency trees focused on deterrence, evacuation, and mutual defense triggers. And independent analysts confirmed their authenticity, concluding that while humanity was prepared for war, it was not seeking one. And this transparency undermined the narrative of hidden aggression, isolating those who had pushed it, and the Council was forced to acknowledge that trust in humanity was rising while trust in traditional enforcers was eroding, and this imbalance became impossible to ignore when a humanitarian crisis erupted in a border region abandoned by its former protector after internal unrest, and millions were at risk as infrastructure failed, and while the Council debated jurisdiction, human fleets were already en route, deploying relief ships, restoring power grids, and coordinating evacuations with local leaders, and they did so without claiming authority, simply stating that lives mattered more than precedent. And the success of this operation was broadcast across the galaxy, not by human media, but by grateful locals. And the political impact was immediate, because species that had once viewed humanity with suspicion now saw a model of power exercised without domination, and this shift alarmed hardliners who understood that influence gained through trust was harder to counter than influence imposed by fear, and in response a clandestine effort emerged to provoke a crisis that would force humanity into a violent overreaction, thereby justifying containment. And this effort took shape as sabotage, targeting a human civilian transport near a densely populated hub, using anonymous assets to mask responsibility, and the explosion killed hundreds, sending shockwaves through human space, and for the first time since the transformation began, public anger surged uncontrollably, and Earth's leadership faced its most dangerous test, because the demand for immediate retribution was loud and widespread, and Admiral Bennett warned that this was exactly the outcome the saboteurs wanted, and Harper urged restraint not as weakness, but as strategy, arguing that the truth would surface if humanity did not obscure it with rage. And after a tense deliberation, President Brooks addressed the public, acknowledging the pain, honoring the dead, and promising justice rather than vengeance. And behind the scenes, human intelligence networks expanded quietly, tracing financial flows, communication patterns, and proxy actors with relentless focus. And what they uncovered over the following weeks revealed a web of interest spanning multiple powers, united not by ideology but by fear of losing control. And when the evidence was finally presented to the Council, it was done calmly and publicly, naming no single villain, but exposing the structure of manipulation itself. And the revelation forced a reckoning, because it showed that the greatest threat to galactic stability was no longer rising species asserting themselves, but entrenched systems willing to sacrifice civilians to preserve hierarchy. And in that moment, many understood that humanity had crossed another invisible line, not just refusing to ask permission, but redefining what legitimacy meant in a galaxy that had grown used to power without accountability. The Council chamber had never been so crowded or so quiet, because the evidence humanity presented did not accuse with anger. It simply exposed patterns that many delegates recognized but had learned to ignore, and as the data streams in, there was no immediate rebuttal, only a slow realization that the galaxy's old balance relied on shadows more than strength, and that those shadows were now illuminated. And the speaker attempted to restore order by calling for procedural review, but the momentum had shifted, because several mid-level species formally requested independent investigations, citing the human findings as justification. And this fractured the traditional voting blocks, and in that fracture humanity did something unexpected again. It stepped back, refusing leadership of the investigative process, and stating publicly that legitimacy required distance, not control. And this refusal confused those who had assumed humanity sought dominance, because it demonstrated confidence rather than ambition. And as investigations began, arrests and resignations followed across multiple administrations, weakening the informal networks that had enforced compliance for generations. And in the midst of this upheaval, a new challenge emerged from the deep fringe, where the unidentified observers previously detected finally revealed themselves through a brief but unmistakable signal, ancient in structure and unlike any modern protocol, indicating awareness rather than threat. And Earth Command decoded enough to understand that these entities had watched humanity's rise closely, assessing not military output, but decision-making under pressure. And Admiral Bennett convened a secure council of scientists, diplomats, and strategists to debate response options, because this was a moment that could define humanity's place not just among peers, but within the deeper history of the galaxy. And Harper argued that silence would be interpreted as uncertainty, while aggression would confirm fears. And so humanity responded openly, broadcasting a simple message stating that humanity sought coexistence based on mutual non-interference and shared responsibility for sentient life. And the response that came days later was equally simple, acknowledging receipt and expressing interest in observation rather than engagement. And this exchange sent ripples through the galaxy because it confirmed that there were layers of power beyond the Council's reach, and that humanity had been noticed by them. And reactions ranged from awe to panic, with some delegates demanding that humanity cease independent contact. And Harper replied that humanity would not restrict communication that posed no harm, and that knowledge could not be unlearned simply because it was inconvenient. And while debates raged, practical consequences unfolded, because trade routes stabilized around human corridors, insurance rates dropped for ships traveling under human protection, and joint ventures flourished in regions once considered too volatile, and this economic shift gradually forced even reluctant powers to adapt, integrating rather than resisting. And yet beneath the progress, tension remained, because not everyone benefited equally, and remnants of old hierarchies continued to resist change through quieter means, such as misinformation campaigns aimed at portraying humanity as manipulative or dangerously influential. And these campaigns found some traction until human media outlets partnered with independent alien journalists to openly dissect and debunk false claims, creating a cross-species standard of verification that further eroded the power of rumor. And this transparency again frustrated those who relied on ambiguity. And as months passed without major conflict, humanity's internal culture also shifted, because citizens who had grown up seeing the galaxy as a distant authority now saw it as a shared space where responsibility mattered. And this awareness fostered a sense of caution as well as pride, because leaders understood that every action now set precedent. And President Brooks reminded his advisors that restraint must remain a choice, not a constraint imposed by fear. And this philosophy guided humanity's response when a border skirmish erupted between two non-human states within a human security zone. And rather than imposing terms, humanity deployed mediators and peacekeepers at the invitation of both sides, facilitating negotiations that ended the conflict without a single human weapon fired. And this success reinforced perception that humanity was redefining strength itself. And by the time the Council convened to review its own charter, proposing reforms that acknowledged distributed authority rather than centralized enforcement, many delegates privately admitted that these changes would not have been possible before humanity stopped asking permission, because the old system had depended on unquestioned hierarchy, and that hierarchy had finally been challenged not by conquest, but by consistent action grounded in accountability. And as the galaxy adjusted to this new reality, one truth became increasingly clear: that humanity's greatest impact was not the fleets it commanded or the technology revealed, but the example it set when faced with power, choosing not to seize it outright, but to use it in ways that made abuse harder for anyone who followed. As reforms moved from discussion to implementation, resistance condensed rather than disappeared, concentrating among those who had lost privilege fastest. And these actors understood that open defiance would fail where subtle pressure had already been exposed. So they turned to influence within influence, targeting frontier regions where oversight was thin and grievances plentiful. And in one such region, a coalition of private security fleets declared an emergency authority, claiming to protect commerce while effectively imposing tolls and blockades that hurt both local populations and human-linked trade. And when complaints reached Earth Command, the response was deliberately measured, because Admiral Bennett recognized the pattern as an attempt to bait intervention that could be framed as overreach, and instead humanity gathered evidence, mapping financial ties, command hierarchies, and communication routes with patient precision, and Daniel Harper coordinated quietly with regional leaders, ensuring that when action came, it would be requested rather than imposed, and that request arrived when shortages turned critical and civilian protests were met with force by the security fleets. And the invitation was public, signed by multiple governments, leaving little room for misrepresentation. And humanity responded not with overwhelming numbers, but with clarity of purpose, deploying a limited task group alongside humanitarian assets and independent observers. And when the private fleets attempted to posture, issuing warnings and broadcasting selective footage, human commanders released full unedited feeds, showing exactly who initiated force and how responses were calibrated. And the confrontation ended quickly as the security fleets stood down under the weight of exposure and legal consequence rather than firepower. And the leaders behind them were arrested by their own clients, seeking distance from the scandal. And this outcome sent a message sharper than any battle, that the era of plausible deniability was ending, and that legitimacy now required transparency. And across the galaxy, younger officers, administrators, and entrepreneurs began aligning themselves with this new norm, seeing opportunity where older elites saw loss. And this generational shift worried those who had built their power on inherited authority. And in a final attempt to reassert relevance, a faction within the Kree Collective proposed a grand reconciliation conference designed to bind humanity into restrictive frameworks under the guise of unity. And the invitation was formal and heavily publicized, and many expected humanity to decline or counter with demands, but Harper accepted without conditions, stating simply that dialogue was always preferable to assumption. And when the conference convened, humanity arrived with no ultimatums, only records of commitments already honored, corridors kept open, crises resolved, agreements respected, and accessions. Progressively became clear that the proposed restrictions were incompatible with the very reforms the Council had begun, and that humanity's refusal to ask permission had exposed contradictions others could no longer ignore, and delegates who had arrived skeptical found themselves questioning why stability required limiting those who had consistently acted to preserve it. And when the conference concluded without binding humanity, the outcome was framed not as failure, but as acknowledgement, and the Kree Collective returned home facing internal pressure to modernize or fragment. And throughout this period, humanity continued its steady work, training joint crews, sharing early warning data, and investing in education exchanges that built familiarity rather than dependence. And these human choices mattered most when the ancient observers sent a second message, this time acknowledging the changes unfolding and stating that intervention would remain unnecessary so long as emergent powers demonstrated stewardship rather than domination. And this message, though brief, carried immense weight because it implied standards that applied to all, not just humanity. And in Private Earth Command reflected on how close the galaxy had come to a very different path. And President Brooks remarked that the hardest part of power was knowing when not to use it. And as humanity looked forward, it did so without illusion, aware that mistakes would come, and that trust once broken was hard to rebuild, but also confident that it no longer needed permission to act responsibly. And that confidence, earned through restraint under pressure, had become the quiet force reshaping alliances, expectations, and the future itself. The final measure of change came not with a war or a declaration, but with normalization, as months turned into a standard cycle and the galaxy adjusted to reality, where human presence was expected rather than debated, and the Council ratified a revised charter that replaced enforcement monopolies with cooperative response frameworks, quietly acknowledging that no single power could dictate order without accountability. And while some founding species abstained rather than endorse, none openly opposed, because the cost of standing apart had become too high, and humanity did not claim authorship of these reforms, allowing others to take credit and ownership, understanding that systems endured longer when they felt shared. And on Earth, President Brooks chose not to seek extended authority, stepping aside as scheduled and reinforcing the idea that human strength came from institutions rather than individuals. And Admiral Bennett began transitioning fleet doctrine from deterrence posture to sustain stability operations, embedding human officers within mixed command structures by invitation, not requirement. And Daniel Harper returned to Earth quietly, declining ceremonial honors and instead teaching at a diplomatic academy, telling students that the most important negotiations were the ones where no one noticed who led them. And across human space, daily life continued, trade flowed, colonies grew, and the memory of being dismissed by the Council slowly shifted from grievance to lesson. And that lesson was shared deliberately with younger generations, not as bitterness but as context, explaining that asking permission had once been necessary to survive, but that survival without dignity was not a future worth accepting, and beyond human territory species that had once feared retaliation now planned openly, knowing that stability no longer depended on silence. And even the Kree Collective began reforms, decentralizing command and opening limited exchanges, driven less by remorse than by recognition that isolation was no longer viable, and the ancient observers remained distant, watching but not intervening, their silence now interpreted as conditional approval rather than indifference. And historians across the galaxy would later argue about the exact moment everything changed, some pointing to the first convoy that refused to turn back, others to the exposure of sabotage networks, and some to the quiet rescue during a staged exercise. But among humans, the answer was simpler and spoken without pride. that the day humanity stopped asking permission was the day it accepted responsibility for consequences as well as choices, and that acceptance reshaped not only how others saw humanity, but how humanity saw itself, no longer as a guest among the stars, but as a participant bound by duty to act when action was required. And as the galaxy moved forward under this new understanding, imperfect and unfinished, one truth endured across cultures and species: that power exercised without accountability fades. But power paired with restraint can change the course of history without firing a final shot. And in that quiet outcome, humanity found not dominance, but something far rarer, a place earned rather than granted, secured not by permission, but by consistent proof that it deserved to stand among the stars.